Hi everyone, Aparna and Harinda here from Rethinking Tech. Today, we're going to be talking about the AI hype train. There have been so many things happening over the last 2 years, but more specifically over the last 7-8 months since Donald Trump has entered office. We should talk about it.
And if you haven't already, remember to hit subscribe so that you don't miss our upcoming episodes. For those of you who haven't filled out the Rethinking Tech survey yet, we'll drop the link in the episode notes. Please go in there, tell us what you think so that we can make our episodes better for you. Welcome back to Rethinking Tech. I'm Aparna.
And I'm Harinda.
Our podcast breaks the topic of tech apart,
covering the surprising connections to geopolitics, business, and ethics.
We're both humanitarians, and I'm a lawyer. And I just hit my personal best record on Duolingo, 680-day streak. But no, I still can't communicate with you fully in Spanish.
And I'm a former entrepreneur, globetrotter, and currently calling in from Germany.
Every week, we break down the hottest tech topics that you need to know about. Today, we'll start by giving you some context about the AI hype train to really ground this discussion, explaining how we got into this AI regulatory mess that we are in. Then, we'll go through 3 main topic areas. The first, how tech has influenced the regulatory discussions we're seeing or not seeing, the geopolitical implications, everyone has a dog in this race, and the ethical implications. Is AI going in the right direction?
I think it's important, because there's so much noise in this discussion, to frame this on why is it important. It impacts you directly because AI has been embedded into basically most of your day. Everything you do within technology interacts very likely some form of AI. And it's going to help simplify your life. It's going to help simplify your work. But at the same time, it's also going to be taking your job. Your hard-earned tax dollars are going to be fueling the next revolution of technology. And all of this without you saying a single word. It's going to happen no matter what you try to say or do. There are so many different players. And starting with the governments, we need to mention the US and China, EU, UK, Canada, Switzerland. Israel is a really, really important player in the AI game. At the same time, you have Saudi, the UAE, and then several other countries. And they are now starting to tout figures of $500 billion of investments, such as the one that the US has pulled together with Stargate, along with Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, along with Oracle and a number of eminent investors. These kind of figures of just investments and within just a few years have become the norm. All the main tech companies are getting in. We're talking about Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, and the list keeps going. The Gen.AI startups that have launched this revolution. So we can, of course, start with ChatGPT, which is owned by OpenAI, but you have Perplexity, DeepSeek out of China, Lovable, which has been one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing startup in the world, raising a massive Series A round, along with Replit, which is another player. And industries are being torn apart, not just the tech industry, biotech, medical, defense, travel, automotive. I mean, everything is getting torn up by AI. And at the same time, you have some non-private sector partners. You have the UN, academia, the Gates Foundations, nonprofits. There's so many players that are now trying to access some of that oxygen for AI discussions. These are all the players that we're talking about, but let's not also forget you and me. Because we are, in the end, the real players in mass as individuals that are going to be absorbing AI and also fueling the AI revolution.
Whether we want to or not. Regardless of whether you get on the AI hype train or not, your data is going to get pulled. Your tax dollars are being used likely right now without you realizing it. In fact, definitely right now without you realizing it. The elected officials you put in place probably didn't tell you that this was going to happen. They frankly probably didn't know about it. I mean, think about your elected official. Do they have any idea even how to spell AI? I'll be impressed if they do. Let's take a step back because there's so many players, there's so many ways that this can go, and there's so many ways that our discussion today can go. And that's why this conversation is all the more important. Harin and I have been doing this podcast now for months, and we realized that we still hadn't hit on the topic that seems to be the tech topic du jour, de semaine, de année. And my French is defeating me right now. My Duolingo Spanish would have been better here. But all that to say, there isn't just a positive way of looking at this. There are also a ton of naysayers. There's also a lot of backlash, be it the environmental impacts that really are not talked about very much, be it the regulatory or lack thereof impacts, be it the companies and the countries that are getting to dictate this one technology that everyone is saying is going to shape the way the world spins and works. But the fact that so few people get to actually take up that space, that oxygen that you were talking about, is something that the rest of us should be worried about. Because AI, the LLMs that are developed through it, they reflect what humanity thinks and what humanity says. But now more and more people are starting to use it as godsend, as advice from their therapists, as advice from their doctors. So we also really want to dig into that. Because let's not forget that if you're not part of the conversation and you're not making a decision, you are making a decision. That decision is being made for you. Those models are being trained on data that may or may not include you, which means that you may or may not get included going forward in the future.
One of the things that I find really interesting, because you have all the famous billionaires now that have been talking about AI, and I've grouped them in my head into three camps, right? So there is the AI is going to save the world camp. There is AI is going to destroy the world camp. And then AI isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And one thing that is very interesting is that the same person can be in multiple camps. You have the very famous Sam Altman, who constantly talks about this is going to solve poverty, this is going to solve all sorts of humanity's problems. But at the same time, he's going out and building bunkers like many of the other ones, because they are also talking about doomsday scenarios when it comes to building out AI. And that's the hard part when we talk about the tech implications. Technology is very likely the most important industry today. And within technology, AI is the most important technology that is fueling the industry. There's something that I had heard some time ago that I also wanted to mention, because you were sort of teasing upon it, Aparna. There was a statement made by Jathan Sadowski, who wrote The Mechanic and the Luddite. And he said, not only are you not going to have a voice in this discussion, but you're not allowed to have a voice in this discussion. Are you a tech billionaire? Are you building the Gen.AI platforms or, technologies? And if you aren't, like where, even if you're an engineer, what is the caliber of engineering skill that you have? Because there's the eminent ones that are getting $1 billion salaries a year. And then there's the other ones that are not. And so the conversation has really shrunk to a very, very small demographic of people. And you're just simply not allowed to have an educated and informed opinion. And the problem with that is that it's categorically wrong.
How is this different from any other topic? Okay, fine. Right now it's billionaires that are getting to control this, but typically it's elected officials or politicians who are making decisions about things that they frankly don't know much about. Is the difference that in a case of democracy, you're choosing the people to represent you who you would hope know more about this, be it about immigration, be it about reform, be it about, yeah, sure, technology. But how is AI any different from every other decision that is made for us?
The way I would frame it is, first off, politicians are usually democratically elected, and so they're representatives of a certain cadre of people. Now, you have the different tiers all the way to the president or prime minister, etc. But the part that I sort of swerve and talk a little bit more from the billionaires/entrepreneurs perspective is the fact that even though they were not democratically elected, they have user numbers backing them up. And when we talk about Apple, we have 1+ billion users. If they've also probably hit 2 billion. Meta, they have hit, 4 billion users. If Google, same thing. When you hit these numbers, we don't need to talk about being democratically elected. You are democratically being used as a technology. And as a result, if somebody's paying for this, that's also capital that's going into their pockets, which allows them to fuel their beliefs, right? Because I think that flow of money is really important. Now, why is AI, again, different? I would lean onto the fact that it's actually sitting on the laurels of what the technology companies have been doing for decades really well, and that's addiction. That is our tech addiction. That is how we have wired ourselves, our societies, our businesses, our livelihoods to technology. And now we are being told AI is just simply going to fuel all of it. And we don't have an alternative, being told that this is just the direction that the world is going to go in. And you just simply don't have a say. This is the part where I think, yes, part of it is the technology, but part of it is the fact that the decision was simply made.
I can't help but go back to the fact that decisions are frequently made for humanity without them deciding it. Sure, you democratically elect someone, but have we heard of lobbyists? Do we know what they do? I would argue that these billionaires have been pulling the strings behind this covered blockade that we had never seen under before, but now are looking behind the curtain and seeing that it's the exact same people making the decisions for us. And I would argue that technically these billionaires that have access to more than half of the world's population in some cases, looking at Meta, are they not better represented to make decisions for humanity? And that's where it comes into who's in power. What do we actually believe in them for doing? Do we trust them? But what better way to show our trust in them than to spend time on their platforms, than to give them our most sensitive thoughts and feelings, and also our data? Isn't this a form of election and voting?
What you ask is a really challenging question. Because on the one side, yes, people spend time on it. But on the other side, people don't want to spend time on it. And this is one of the funny things about not just AI, but tech, is the fact that it has been built and wired into your psyche in such a way that you are addicted to it. And so when people are asked from a rational perspective, not everybody, of course, but there are large swaths of people that are complaining about their tech addiction, about how much time they spend on tech, how much time they spend on social media, the ripple effects of that. And a lot of that is being driven by AI. So the algorithms have gotten so good at feeding you things that are making you addicted that as a result, you are being looped in against your own will. And this is making you feed more of that data. And so it's the same thing. It's the same loop that we're seeing with addiction. And when I think of it that way, yes, people have voted in the sense that they are giving their time, but I don't know that this is a consensual relationship.
Interesting. Because I'm sure it feels a little ridiculous, no? To say things like you're addicted to Facebook and that's why it's not your fault, it's theirs that you're on it, because it seems so different from a drug. But when you actually look at the way our brains work, and science has proven this time and time again, this is a form of addiction.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, because there's so many alternatives now to Facebook, there's of course Instagram, which is also under Meta. You have TikTok, you have LinkedIn, so social media in general. But just the phone itself is an addiction. So there's a ton of studies being done about how many times somebody checks the time on their phone. And that is a way of being able to see how many times you are mentally or cognitively going into that space where you need a fix. And there's a really interesting parallel to that because again, what you're starting to see is these statistics are constantly and every year going up. Average time on social media is a couple of hours a day across the globe, across billions of people. And so when you see that, that's the part where I would say you're not addicted to the product. You're not necessarily even addicted to the company, but you are addicted to the features. And the different features are there serving you as you need it, when you need it, and as much as you need it. And that feedback is the one that is just keeping you doom scrolling constantly.
Fair. Okay, so I want to talk more about the tech players in this space. You named a bunch of them, but I think there's a few main ones that we can really talk about, and they're the ones with the gajillion-dollar market cap if they're publicly traded. I would say we're looking at Google. I won't give Apple the courtesy of including them in this discussion. I'd say Google. I'd say OpenAI. And would you say Microsoft?
Yeah, absolutely. Because they were first funding OpenAI. Now they have a rift and they're trying to find their own way, but they are also the central nervous system for the business world. So yeah,
That's
absolutely.
Fair. Am I missing any? Or do you think those are the main three?
Of the big players,
NVIDIA.
Meta.
Yes, Meta.
NVIDIA, of course.
NVIDIA, of course,
Yeah.
Yes. AMD's trying. Okay, so maybe we're looking
at
AMD
is just being added as a token gesture.
They're the little brother.
Yeah.
They get to tag along to the parties. Okay, so I'm writing this down. We have NVIDIA, we have Meta, we have Google, we obviously have OpenAI, the golden child, and we have Microsoft. Okay.
And the way I've grouped it in my head is you have the very large companies that are in part financing it, but in part bringing the masses as quickly as possible. But then you have these startups, which now it's hard to say startup because I think OpenAI has hit 800, 900 million users. But they are also moving incredibly fast. They're burning through tons of cash. And at the same time, they're sort of the complementary technology for these players.
When we look at who gets to determine what's happening with AI, I mean, it's not us, the users. And we can talk about governments when we get to the geopolitical discussion, but really, it's these companies. And I think it's important to separate, for people who aren't as familiar, the difference between the NVIDIA and all of the others. So the Metas, the Googles, the OpenAI, the Microsoft, because NVIDIA is critical. It provides those chips that are required for any of this AI ecosystem to actually function. Forget flourish, but function, which is why NVIDIA, I think, is very well positioned, regardless of what happens with the regulation, regardless of what happens with what direction AI decides to go in, to come out as the number one winner in all of this. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the most profitable company by the end of next year.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, especially for all these investments, a certain fraction of it and a significant fraction has to go to NVIDIA. There's also some other really interesting players like ASML, which is part of NVIDIA's sort of ecosystem, which are holding a monopoly. And this is one of the things that I find really interesting, because even though they generate tons in sales, they're growing at similar paces as NVIDIA, their market cap is significantly lower. They're still in the hundreds of billions of euros because it's a Dutch company. And this is the part that I also find really interesting. So, of course, the revenue figures are huge for NVIDIA, but the revenue multiples on their market cap are categorically different between American firms and non-American firms.
And for that reason, TSMC, let's not
Hmm.
forget about them, located
Absolutely.
in the beautiful country or state/province, depending on where you fall, of Taiwan.
One thing that we're seeing with companies is that tech companies are making tech company sized gambles on AI because they still harvest this sort of startup mentality that we need to gamble everything to keep innovating and we need to keep running this hype train. But I also distinguish this between other companies that are leveraging AI. So you have biotech companies that are using it for research, the defense industry, you have the automotive industry, the travel industry. So all of these other industries that don't necessarily or solely rely on AI, they have to now shift a lot of their focus because also consumers need to hear AI is happening. There's something that's also happening. A lot of companies are being priced out from being part of the discussion. And the reason for it is if you have an open AI that is receiving tens of billions at $300 billion valuations, and very few companies can make these kind of gambles. And OpenAI is wholly focused on AI. But an automotive company that is 50, 60, 70 billion dollars and they generate billions of dollars in revenues a year, they can't make those kind of gambles. And so they can only apportion a certain fraction of their budget to be able to develop on AI.
What would it take a startup to be successful in this? Is it too late? Are they too far behind? I mean, getting in and beating OpenAI just seems impossible right now. We see others that are trying. Perplexity's definitely giving them a run for their money or trying. But we saw DeepSeek. What would a startup that is well positioned in the AI space look like? I would argue that they'd be focusing on markets that are underserved, likely in the global south, because the global south is always underserved, unfortunately. They'd be looking at making things more effective, more efficient. That's where we saw DeepSeek come out. So there is still space, but the funding is going to be the tricky piece because I feel like all the funding is tied up in those certain companies. And before we move on completely from the tech space, I think it's worth talking about how tech companies can impact regulations. Because theoretically, tech companies look out for tech companies. They look out for profit. They look out for revenue. They don't necessarily care about anything else. And they are not required to. That's not their role in society. The role in society of taking care of society is that of governments. However, do you think these tech companies owe people anything? Frankly, I am of the opinion that they don't. I am of the opinion that they play within the lines. The lines are set by regulators. And if they color outside the lines, slap them with a fine, put them in jail, do what you have to. But if they're going within the lines, and if there are no lines, it's a blank page, then it's not on them to add the lines.
I think this goes back to the capitalist arguments. What function of responsibility should be within any of these tech companies, tobacco companies, insurance companies, all of these different industries? And I think that you're absolutely right. They're there for shareholder value. And in order for them to do that, they are going to be focusing on what is going to bring them that shareholder value. In order for all of these companies to win, I think one of the first and most important things we have to mention is the business model. We still have not seen a business model that makes sense in the AI world. Of course, there's companies that are doing AI in very sophisticated and profitable ways, but with the massive investments that are going into specifically Gen AI, but some other AI investments, if you are throwing in a few $100 billion of investment, you need to be churning out quite a substantial return for your investors. And so far, most of these Gen AI companies are not just not profitable, they're running negatives at the individual user level. So your $20 subscription of ChatGPT Plus is actually losing OpenAI tons of money. And that in itself is a core and fundamental problem that this entire industry has. And it's fueling some of the discussions of this is just a bubble, because these guys, brilliant as they are as engineers, they have not figured out the finances.
I don't think it's a problem because I think this is exactly how the VC industry works. I use the example of Uber time and time again. They weren't profitable for many, many years. Once you become a part of society, once you're ingrained, and you said it best yourself, once you cannot imagine your day without it, there's no way it's going away. The business model will come later. I'm not saying it makes sense from a business perspective, but I'm saying it's a model we've seen time and time again. They don't need to worry about being profitable. They can afford to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to their top engineers because they know the money will come. The VC funnel is there. I mean, that's why they went to the GCC, right? Silicon Valley didn't have enough money, so they had to go out there. But let's talk about the geopolitics.
So why is it that the geopolitics is important? One of the things that we're seeing at the country level is that it's fueling fights between countries. First off, we know that US is always talking about their anti-China rhetoric. And there's this challenge from a circular perspective, because in order for AI to be fueled, you need chips. And in order for chips to be built, you need rare earth minerals. And China has a monopoly almost on the supply and the entire supply chain of rare earth minerals. So if you don't get that into the US or where the manufacturing is happening for the chips, you don't get your AI. And then as a result, your AI isn't going to go and beat Chinese AI. All of this to say, that's a problem, because at the same time, it's making the world less stable, more risky, not just from a financial perspective, but from a safety perspective. Because when a government is really leaning into this technology, it's also making this very radical decision of focusing on AI as their sort of economic savior. There's also these two different philosophies between the US approach and the Chinese approach that we're starting to see, where the US is saying America first, it's AI first, and they're, going down this route, where China is taking the multilateral approach. They're talking about safety. They're trying to be, they're trying to use soft power. What are your thoughts when it comes to this dynamic between these two different philosophies?
When we look at the two different strategies, it's the America first, innovation and developing locally, building for America, versus China is across the supply chain. And they're a little bit in everything, or a lot in everything, just not as much as the US, let's say, in the actual final chip production. But I would say China has such a head start. They started this, 2 decades ago? At least minimum with the Belt Road Initiative to get there, start accessing those rare earth minerals, which, for what it's worth, and I've said this before, they're not actually rare. They're actually available widely, but China has access to 90% of the current global supply chain. So they're really far ahead. And that's why when you have conversations between the US and China, where the US is restricting China's access to chips and tariffing them over and over again, they are actually just shooting themselves in the foot over and over again. That's all they're successfully doing, because they need China more than China really needs them right now. China, I think, in the next year or so, is going to make a case for Taiwan being annexed. And Taiwan is home to TSMC, which the US sorely needs. However, the US also needs China. So if caught between being in a partnership, being in a relationship, a situationship with China, or having access to TSMC, what do you think the US government would do?
The US does not have the capacity, or perhaps even the allies, willing to go against China. And so this would be one of the places where their unique gamble of focusing on AI may fail. And so they have to tread lightly, and Donald Trump is not known to tread lightly in terms of this negotiation and this dance that they have when it comes to AI, chips, chip production, etc. I would suspect that they would try to use this current tariff rate that's much higher than everybody anticipated. And they would try to leverage some of the existing negatives to then remove tariffs and create concessions in such a way that would help that happen. If China annexes Taiwan, then there's a number of other political and security implications, and that could really create our third world war.
And it directly relates to tech, right? Because if TSMC wasn't there, I don't know if the US would be as inclined to get involved. We've already seen the US falter a little bit on the NATO side unless certain conditions are made. We've already seen its allies, relationships falter just because of the way that the last 8 months have played out. And so with the US's new requirements that TSMC build factories and operations in the US, I'm curious if that's their way of hedging against the possible bet.
And I actually want to ask you a slightly different question, because one of the things that we also started seeing is that a lot of the investments that are going to AI companies, they start in the States, they get a certain level of traction, and then they go to the Middle East. And that's because when you're talking about the 500 billion figures, you need some of that Middle East money to come in and sort of top up. And one of the things that I find really interesting is what are the interests that the US, China, and the Middle East, and specifically Saudi, Qatar, and the UAE, what are they trying to get at? And of course, nobody knows. Some people have theories. But how do you think that all of these countries are looking at this?
I think they just want to be part of the conversation. They're trying to move forward. And UAE's done tremendously in that regard. When you just look at infrastructure and development, they weren't really considered even a travel destination, 35 years ago? And now they're one of the top travel destinations. I think luxury, Dubai Bling, Netflix doing wonders for them. But now we're seeing more and more of the Gulf realize that they are not secondary to Dubai, that they're not secondary to UAE, and they can get ahead. Saudi has way more in terms of financial backing, and they have actually been making tremendous investments in the tech space for years. PIF has been very, very involved in OpenAI's raises, even before the most recent visit. Keep going back to Uber as an example. Their names are all over the tech companies' books. So it makes sense for them to be there. And now they just want to actually move their countries forward using AI.
There's an unspoken part of that question as well, right? So in my opinion, these are the only players that can afford to play in this game. Okay, so that completely excludes the UK, the EU, Canada, whoever else you want to be able to mention. They are spectators in this AI game. And that's because they are making 1/10, 1/15, 1/5 maybe, but very rarely 1/5 of the types of investments that the US is talking about. And that in itself means that they've been priced out. Once we talk about these, I think that one of the interesting things about China is that they are not leaning into AI as though it's the end all and be all of the country's strategy. And one, it's also because they are a manufacturing capital of the world. So you need China as of today in order for you to be able to get everything from clothing to parts to rare earths to all sorts of things. Whereas the US is really trying to transition a vast majority of their economy in that direction until such time that manufacturing re-enters the US, because it's been exported to Asia and other lower cost countries for decades. And all of this to say that I think that the US has really made AI this sort of really central focus. I think that China has been making it a focus, but not its sole focus. They realize that they need to hedge their bets because they have so many interests, not just within China, but across the globe. And I agree with you on the Middle East. They have the money to be at the table. And so they just want to be part of the conversation because they can. And as a result, they don't need to justify it. They can throw the 100 billion, 500 billion numbers out there without really batting an eyelid, and their name will be mentioned. And so they stay relevant in this geopolitical game.
What do you think about those nations that have started to develop their own sovereign LLMs? I'm thinking Switzerland right now. And do you think it's a realistic model for other countries to replicate?
Not everybody needs this AGI that everybody's worshiping. The technology as of today is very powerful. And one of the things that we know is that it can generate savings, it can generate value just as a technology today. But the biggest problem is that individuals, companies, and nations have not absorbed or adopted it in such a way to generate that value. And so being able to create a sovereign AI, sovereign tech, or even the infrastructure to drive AI, so everything from the chips manufacturing to the data rooms, etc., that play in itself is actually quite interesting. One, from a geopolitical perspective, because it does protect you, right? What we're seeing now from the US administration is the fact that they are calling in the bets that all countries have made to rely on the US big brother for decades. And you do this with tech, you could literally crumble your entire nation, your infrastructure, etc. So I think it's strategic and security-wise good move. But the other thing is it takes time for this kind of change from a technological and adoption perspective for it to reach the masses. And so bringing all of this down to an individual sovereign level, frankly speaking, especially with the free resources out there in terms of models, data that's been made available, etc., I think it's really great. The other piece that is an interesting debating point is the values that countries are starting to bake into AI. Because what we are seeing is that the American approach to AI has a set of values. Whether you like it or not, it has a set of values. And we're starting to see all the different nations and companies, they are baking those values according to what they believe. And when I hear Switzerland, they are also doing the same from their perspective. And it does really feel very Swiss, very neutral, their approach, and very safe. And in that way, that new dimension for this discussion could be a really interesting one for a lot of other nations to adopt.
Especially at a time when globalization has essentially equivocated culture to Americanization, and countries are becoming more and more aware. And it can be something as simple as how the LLM responds to you and how confident it is to be like, hey, double check this. It can be the difference between X's Grok versus OpenAI's ChatGPT, which always thinks that you have the best idea and you should do absolutely everything. From something as simple as tone to actual content to actually reflecting morals and values, which is where actually people had concerns with DeepSeek, because DeepSeek, not that it had propaganda, I'm not going to use that word, but it had a different interpretation of how certain historical events occurred. And some people were unhappy with that.
A lot of people have been talking poorly about DeepSeek because they were saying that the Chinese government has its foot in the technology, in the data, and as a result, you should be very wary about using that. And one of the things that we also know is that the US government does the exact same thing on the other side. And now when you look at the direction in which different countries have chosen to go from a geopolitical and policy perspective, you can make your decision whether you like it or not. One of the things you said is very fair and very true. The data that is being fed into a lot of these models is highly Americentric because the US generates a lot of data. But at the same time, the outputs are actually quite similar, if not uniform, when you go across cultures and languages. And I think that point is actually underserved because a lot of cultural sensitivities are not taken into account. But nonetheless, almost all AI, goes in this very similar direction of having similar types of responses and that kind of thing. That uniformity is one of the things that is going to be a blocker for adoption going globally. Instead of everybody having or being forced to adopt AI as a technology with this uniformity, sovereign tech or values-based or just having diverse options could be an interesting alternative.
Well, there's that startup idea that I was wondering about. We started this conversation by saying who should be in charge of AI regulation. That's what I've been wondering anyway. So let's talk about it. Is it the governments? Because now when we think about AI regulation, let's set the stage. It doesn't make sense unless it's a globally agreed upon standard, because that's just the way borders work right now. They don't. You're not going to keep out AI systems. We saw that when Italy tried to find DeepSeek. And DeepSeek was just like, I'm not paying that fine. You don't have to use our platform in your country. And then Italy was very confused. So if you don't have a uniform agreed upon legislation, or at least standards, if not legislation, standards, guidelines, guiding principles, then it's actually impossible to have anything in place. You can try locally and from a government perspective, but is it even possible to align on principles and standards right now using just the two examples you gave of China versus America being all in on AI, America probably preferring to focus on innovation instead of regulation because, again, this is their 100,000% bet on the future, versus China, using it as an example, realizing there might be other things in this world and focusing on other things, and then maybe having a less biased perspective on AI regulation. And then you can't forget about the EU. EU's the only one that's come out with an AI Act right now. And they're so good at regulating, even though they don't have anything to regulate or don't have much. They don't have much to regulate. Where do you fall on all of this? Ethically, what do you think should be done versus what do you think actually will be done?
I think this is central to one of the core discussions that revolves around AI. And my feelings are that we need to balance safety with competitiveness. What that really means is that every country, every company, they need to figure out the machine that allows them to continue not just surviving, but thriving. And that business model and how you're going to make money, et cetera, those are things that need to be figured out. I sense that many economies have not done that. They are sitting on the laurels of the past. And I look at, in Europe, tourism generates a ton of value. Old companies that, are sort of historic, generate a lot of value, et cetera. But you start seeing the trends in which many of them are losing market cap. Many of them are losing revenue. Many of them are losing relevance. All of this to say is that they have lost the thread when it comes to business model and survivability. And so for me, the regulation aspect is one of these threads that is really important from a safety perspective. But one of the things that I'm also seeing is that if you overregulate and put too much emphasis on regulation, but you haven't figured out how to survive, that regulation is not going to matter if your companies are dying. And we started seeing this with the EU when Donald Trump came in. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU commissioner, basically said, we're going to repeal much of the climate legislation and climate requirements for reporting because they are making our companies non-competitive. And this mindset is just because they knew this from the start. It wasn't that they needed Donald Trump to come in. They just knew that Donald Trump would push the advantage that the US has so much from a competitiveness perspective. But when you push your advantage to that point, you really start to lose more and more market share faster. And where I'm stuck is how much regulation do we need for future risks that we are not able to anticipate versus how much effort should the Europes, the UKs, the Canadas, and many of the other markets focus on getting that engine started for their economies to take off.
Why not just regulate the risks that you know exist? Why worry about the future right now? Because I find that we are so caught up in worrying about why regulate if you can't get all of the risks. Fair, you're never going to get all the risks. We still don't know all the risks with driving, but we have laws out there. We have seatbelts required because we have enough knowledge and enough data to know what risks do exist. We know about things like bias. We know about things like discrimination. And we know that the algorithms are not great at filtering for that. So why not build for that? And that's where I'm stuck. I'm stuck with the all or nothing approach. I don't think it makes sense to regulate risks that don't exist. So that's just a waste of everyone's time. But regulate the things that you do know are going to happen because you have lived life, because this has happened time and time again. And it would be the equivalent of not putting seatbelts in autonomous vehicles because you're like, oh, it's a different vehicle. We don't know the risks. We can't put any parameters in place. No, put in the seatbelts. Come on, put in the child seat. Let's do this. So why are we allowing it to happen in this capacity? And that's where I'm confused. It seems so obvious.
I think that a lot of the devil is in the details. So you were saying, why don't we put child seats? And what technologists are saying is, why do you need child seats when the car isn't moving? There's probably no wheels and there's probably no steering column, there's no brakes, but that's because the car is up on bricks. It's not on wheels. It's not moving. There's no engine. And they're saying that we're at such an early stage of the technology that it's hard to legislate because what does a child seat look like? And I think that one of the things you were suggesting about bias, one of the things that we're also seeing is that the world's values are not uniform. And it's so hard for people to agree on what bias means. It's really hard for legislators to look at the democratic process and agree that this is the right direction to move forward in. Because at the same time, you're starting to see the far-right movements come back. These more conservative or traditional values are making the liberal values of bias, these definitions sort of clash against each other. So when you go down to the detail of how do you legislate bias, they probably can't even agree on the definitions. And this is the part where we talk about values. And I think what you're talking about is unbelievably important. There was a French designer called Philippe Starck. He said, the world existed 2.5 billion years ago. The world's going to exist for another 2.5 billion years. And For some reason, this is the evolution of humankind that believes that we will not evolve anymore. We will just stay here and we need to make this version perfect today. The reason that I think that this statement is so important is that we have not evolved to the point of having some sense of uniformity on values in order for us to regulate it. And the amount of effort it takes to get consensus is exactly the type of capital that technologists are saying, let's just put that into competitiveness and let's make this machine go. Let's see what it can do.
This is why I'm wondering why you can't build the spaceship as you're driving it forward. Why can't you build the regulations while you're figuring it out? Why is it one or the other? Out of fear of sounding like yet another regulator, this is a topic that is clearly very difficult to figure out. That's not to say that we're not going to, but maybe we didn't do it in this 40-minute episode. Thanks for joining us. New episodes drop every Tuesday. See you then.